Part 1, the stars had always been there, watching Earth from a distance. For thousands of years, humans looked up and wondered if anyone else was out there. They built telescopes, sent radio signals, and dreamed of the day when someone would answer back. That day finally came on a Tuesday morning in March. Jake Morrison was drinking his third cup of coffee when the alert came through. He was the captain of humanity's first deep space vessel, the Horizon's Edge, and he had been waiting for this moment his entire career. The message was simple and clear. Someone had answered humanity's call. The response came from something called the Galactic Assembly. They were a group of alien species who had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. They had rules, laws, and a whole civilization that humans knew nothing about. The message said that Earth had been noticed, and that representatives should come to meet them at a place called Neutral Station. Jake wasn't alone on this mission. With him was Lisa Grant, a scientist who studied biology and had spent years preparing for alien contact. She was smart, careful, and always asked the right questions. There was also Pete Harris, the security commander. Pete was the kind of person who stayed calm no matter what happened. Together, the three of them would represent all of humanity. The journey to Neutral Station took 3 weeks. The station was enormous, bigger than any city on Earth. It orbited a small brown star and had docking ports for hundreds of different ships. As the Horizon's Edge approached, they could see vessels of every shape and size. Some looked like crystals, others like living creatures. None of them looked anything like human ships. When they docked and stepped onto the station, Jake felt the weight of history on his shoulders. They were led through corridors that seemed to shift and change color. The air smelled strange, like metal and flowers mixed together. Other aliens passed them in the hallways. Some had fur, some had scales, and some seemed to be made of light itself. All of them stopped to stare at the humans. The meeting chamber was massive. Thousands of beings filled the seats, representing hundreds of different species. The noise was incredible. Translators built into their suits turned the alien languages into English, but even then, it was hard to follow. Everyone seemed to be talking about the humans. At the center of the room stood a tall creature with blue skin and 4 arms. This was Ambassador Kravik, the leader of the Farron Empire. He was one of the most powerful beings in the assembly. When he spoke, everyone listened. Kravik looked down at the human delegation. His face was hard to read, but his voice carried disappointment. He began to speak about Earth. He had studied humanity's biological data, the information that had been included with their first message. What he said next made Jake's stomach drop. According to Kravik, humans were the weakest species the assembly had ever encountered. Their bones broke easily. Their skin tore from simple injuries. They could only breathe one type of air. They lived for barely 100 years, while some species lived for thousands. They couldn't survive in extreme heat or cold. They needed to eat and drink constantly. By every measure the assembly used, humans were too fragile to survive on their own. The chamber filled with murmurs. Some aliens seemed concerned. Others seemed amused. A few even laughed. Kravik continued, saying that Earth should be placed under protected status. This meant that stronger species would watch over humanity, keeping them safe like parents watching over children. Humans would not be allowed to explore dangerous regions of space. They would not be allowed to make their own decisions about important matters. They would be protected, but they would not be free. Jake felt his face grow hot. He looked at Lisa and Pete. They both wore the same expression. Anger mixed with determination. This wasn't what they had traveled across space to hear. This wasn't what humanity deserved. The vote was about to begin. Thousands of hands, claws, and tentacles were rising to support Kravik's proposal. It seemed like humanity's fate was already decided. Then Lisa stepped forward. Her voice was quiet at first, but it carried through the chamber. She asked a single question. Before they decided humanity's fate, wouldn't they like to know how humans had gotten here? How had a species so weak and fragile managed to build ships that could cross the stars? Kravik seemed annoyed by the interruption, but curiosity won out. He gestured for Lisa to continue. The chamber grew quiet. Lisa walked to the center of the room. She activated a holographic display that showed images of Earth. Beautiful mountains, deep oceans, vast forests. Then the images changed. They showed Earth's predators. Lions, sharks, bears, wolves. Creatures that were stronger, faster, and more dangerous than humans. They showed natural disasters. Earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanoes. Events that could kill thousands in moments. She explained that humans had evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill them. Every other creature on Earth was better designed for survival. Humans had no claws, no fangs, no armor, no venom. They were slow, weak, and vulnerable. By all logic, they should have died out millions of years ago, but they didn't. Lisa showed images of early humans, small groups of people with simple tools. She explained how they survived not by being strong, but by being smart. They learned to make fire, to craft weapons, to build shelters. When they couldn't overpower predators, they outsmarted them. When they couldn't survive the cold, they invented clothing. When they couldn't run fast enough, they learned to track prey until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. Humans survived because they refused to accept their limitations. Every problem became a puzzle to solve. Every weakness became a reason to invent something new. The chamber was silent now. Every eye was on Lisa. She brought up medical images next. Broken bones that had healed. Damaged organs that had been replaced. Diseases that had been cured. She explained that humans had declared war on death itself. They had learned to cut open their own bodies to fix what was broken inside. They had learned to trick their immune systems into fighting diseases. They had learned to replace body parts with mechanical versions that worked even better than the originals. Jake watched the faces in the crowd. Confusion was turning into fascination. Fear was turning into respect. These aliens had never needed to fight for survival the way humans had. They had evolved to be strong and durable. Humans had evolved to be adaptable and clever. Lisa finished her presentation with one final statement. She said that the assembly measured species by what nature had given them, but humans measured themselves by what they had taken from a universe that wanted them dead. The vote was postponed. The assembly needed time to think. Part 2 3 days passed after Lisa's presentation. The human delegation stayed in quarters assigned to them on neutral station. The rooms were strange, designed for beings very different from humans. The beds were too hard, the lights too bright, and the temperature kept shifting. But Jake, Lisa, and Pete made it work. They always made it work. During those 3 days, something unexpected happened. Aliens started visiting them. Scientists, diplomats, and soldiers from dozens of different species wanted to talk to the humans. They had questions. Lots of questions. A Theran medical officer came first. Her name was difficult to pronounce, so she told them to call her Vel. She had 4 arms and stood nearly 8 feet tall. Her skin was the color of a clear sky. She asked Lisa about human medicine. Lisa explained how human doctors performed surgery. She showed videos of operations where doctors opened up bodies, fixed problems, and closed them back up. Vel watched with growing horror. On her world, bodies healed themselves naturally. The idea of cutting into flesh on purpose seemed like torture, but Lisa kept explaining. She showed how humans replaced failing hearts with mechanical pumps, how they took organs from one person and put them into another, how they used electricity to restart stopped hearts, how they created artificial blood when the real thing ran out, how they even put people to sleep in frozen chambers when injuries were too severe, buying time until better treatments could be found. Vel's horror turned to amazement. She realized that human fragility had forced them to become the best doctors in the galaxy. They had to be. Their lives depended on it. More visitors came. A Quilith engineer wanted to know about human technology. The Quilith were beings made of crystalline structures. They were naturally strong and could interface directly with computer systems using their minds. They didn't understand why humans built things the way they did. Pete showed him human tools, simple things like hammers, screwdrivers, and wrenches. Then he showed more complex things. Exoskeletons that made humans 10 times stronger. Spacesuits that let them survive in any environment. Vehicles that carried them across any terrain. Weapons that made them as dangerous as any predator. The Quilith engineer studied each item carefully. He finally understood. Humans built extensions of themselves. Every tool was a way to overcome a limitation. They couldn't breathe in space, so they built suits. They couldn't lift heavy objects, so they built machines. They couldn't see in the dark, so they built lights. Their technology wasn't just equipment. It was evolution by other means. Jake spent his time talking to military officers from different species. They were curious about human combat tactics. Most species fought in straightforward ways. They used their natural advantages in overwhelming force. The strongest warrior won. The biggest army won. It was simple. Jake explained that humans almost never won fair fights. They were too weak for that, so they didn't fight fair. They used terrain to their advantage. They struck from ambush. They retreated when facing superior force, then attacked when the enemy was tired. They poisoned water supplies, destroyed supply lines, and spread false information to confuse opponents. One officer, a massive creature covered in thick armor plates, seemed offended. He said this sounded like cowardice. Real warriors faced their enemies directly. Jake didn't get angry. He just smiled and asked a simple question. If the goal was to survive and protect your people, did it matter how you won? Was it better to die with honor or live without it? The officer had no answer. On the fourth day, the Galactic Assembly reconvened. The chamber was even more crowded than before. Word had spread about the humans. Everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Ambassador Kravik stood at the center again. His expression was different now, less certain. He announced that the Assembly had reviewed all information about humanity. They had consulted with experts. They had debated for hours, and they had reached a decision. But before announcing it, Kravik said he wanted to ask the humans a direct question. He looked at Jake and asked why humans had come to space in the first place. What did they want from the galaxy? Jake stood up. He thought about all the reasons humans had dreamed of the stars. The curiosity, the desire to explore, the hope of finding others like them. But he decided to tell the truth in the simplest way possible. He said that humans came to space because their planet was small and fragile. Just like them, they knew that someday something might destroy Earth. An asteroid, a disease, or something they couldn't predict. If all humans stayed on one world, then one disaster could end everything. So they had to spread out. They had to survive, not because they were brave or special, but because they were terrified of extinction. The chamber was completely silent. Jake continued. He said that humans understood something that many species might not. Survival wasn't guaranteed. It didn't matter how strong you were or how advanced your technology was. The universe was dangerous and random. The only way to survive was to never stop adapting, never stop learning, and never give up no matter how bad things got. Kravik listened carefully. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect in Theron culture. He announced the Assembly's decision. Humanity would not be given protected status. Instead, they would be granted provisional membership. This meant they could travel freely, establish colonies, and participate in assembly discussions. They would be watched carefully, and their status would be reviewed in 1 year. But they would be free. The chamber erupted in noise. Some species cheered. Others protested. But the decision was made. Lisa let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Pete grinned and clapped Jake on the shoulder. They had done it. Humanity had earned its place among the stars. But as they celebrated, none of them knew what was coming. Far beyond the edges of explored space, something was moving. A threat that would test everything humanity claimed to be. A threat that would show the galaxy exactly what humans meant when they said they refused to die. The Vorath were coming. Part 3. 6 months had passed since humanity joined the Galactic Assembly. In that time, human ships had begun exploring new regions of space. Trade agreements were signed. Cultural exchanges started. Some aliens visited Earth and some humans visited alien worlds. Everything seemed to be going well. Jake Morrison had returned to Earth briefly but was now back in space, commanding a small human outpost near the frontier. Lisa Grant had stayed on Neutral Station, working with alien scientists to share knowledge. Pete Harris was training with Assembly security forces, learning their methods while teaching them a few human tricks. Then the warnings started coming in. The first report was from a mining colony on the edge of explored space. The entire facility had gone dark. No distress signal, no explanation, just silence. The Assembly sent a ship to investigate. That ship never returned. More colonies went silent. Whole stations disappeared. Whatever was attacking moved fast and left nothing behind. No survivors, no clues, just empty structures floating in space. The Galactic Assembly called an emergency meeting. Representatives from every species gathered to discuss the threat. Intelligence officers presented what little they knew. The attacks were coming from beyond the galactic rim, from a region of space that had never been explored. Whatever was out there was moving toward the core of Assembly territory. Finally, they got their first look at the enemy. A science vessel managed to capture footage before being destroyed. The beings in the video were unlike anything in Assembly records. They stood nearly 10 feet tall with bodies that seemed to be made of dark gray stone. They had 6 limbs, each ending in sharp claws. Their heads had no visible eyes, just cracks in the stone that glowed with red light. Someone in the intelligence division identified them from ancient legends. They were called the Voreth. Stories said they came from a world where the surface was molten rock and the atmosphere was poison. They had evolved to survive in conditions that would kill anything else. Their stone-like skin could withstand extreme temperatures and pressure. They could survive in the vacuum of space without protection. They felt no pain and showed no mercy. The assembly mobilized its defense fleets. Ships from dozens of species gathered to stop the Voreth advance. The first major battle took place near a gas giant in the outer rim. The assembly fleet was impressive. Hundreds of warships with weapons that could destroy planets, shields that could withstand any attack they'd ever faced. The best military minds in the galaxy commanding them. They were confident. They shouldn't have been. The Voreth ships were crude by comparison. Rough metal hulls with no elegant design, but they were effective. When the battle started, the Voreth didn't try to avoid weapons fire. They didn't need to. Energy weapons hit their ships and did almost nothing. Physical projectiles bounced off their hulls. Even nuclear weapons barely slowed them down. The Voreth ships closed the distance and began ramming assembly vessels. Their hulls were so strong they just tore through shields and armor like paper. Voreth warriors boarded ships through the holes. Once inside, they were unstoppable. Bullets couldn't hurt them. Blades couldn't cut them. Fire didn't burn them. They walked through defensive positions and killed everything in their path. The battle lasted 4 hours. The assembly lost 60% of its fleet. The Voreth lost 3 ships. It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. News of the defeat spread quickly. Panic followed. Species that had never known fear suddenly understood what it meant. The assembly called for a full retreat. All colonies near the frontier were ordered to evacuate. Everyone was pulling back to more defensible positions. Neutral Station was one of the evacuation points. Thousands of refugees were arriving every day, ships packed with families, workers, and soldiers who had abandoned their posts. The station's resources were stretched thin. Food was running low. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. And everyone knew the Voreth were still coming. Ambassador Kravik issued an order. All non-essential personnel should leave the station immediately. That included the human delegation. Lisa Grant received the message in her lab. She was working with a team of scientists, trying to analyze Voreth biology from the limited footage they had. When the evacuation order came through, she ignored it. There was too much work to do. Pete Harris was in the security center, helping coordinate the arrival of refugee ships. When he saw the order, he deleted it from his terminal. He wasn't leaving while people still needed help. Jake Morrison was 3 days away on the horizon's edge when he heard about the evacuation. He immediately changed course and headed for Neutral Station at maximum speed. If his people were there, he was going to be there too. 2 days later, the Voreth arrived. Their ships came out of faster-than-light travel right at the edge of the station's sensor range. There were dozens of them. Alarms blared across Neutral Station. The remaining defense fleet, barely 20 ships, moved to intercept. Everyone knew it wouldn't be enough. On the station, most of the remaining residents ran for the docking bays, fighting to get on the last evacuation ships. But not everyone ran. In the security center, Pete Harris was coordinating with the small human military presence on the station. There were 43 human soldiers assigned as a token security force. They had 2 light fighter craft and a supply ship. Not much, but it would have to do. Colonel Danny Wright commanded the human forces. He was older than most of the soldiers, with gray hair and scars from a dozen battles on Earth. When Pete explained the situation, Danny just nodded. He'd faced bad odds before. Ambassador Kravik appeared on the communication screen. His blue face looked tired and defeated. He told the humans they should evacuate immediately. There was no point in staying. The Voreth couldn't be stopped. Danny looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he said something that Kravik would remember for the rest of his life. He said that humans had a saying back on Earth. When you corner something weak and fragile, when you take away all its options and make it choose between dying slowly or dying quickly, that's when you find out what it's really made of. And humans, Danny explained, were very good at being cornered. The first Voreth ships reached the defense fleet. The battle was brief and brutal. Assembly ships fired everything they had and achieved almost nothing. The Vorath pushed through and headed straight for the station. Danny's soldiers took their positions. They weren't at the docking bays where the Vorath would likely breach. They were in the corridors behind those bays, in the maintenance tunnels, in the ventilation systems, anywhere they could hide. Because humans didn't fight fair, and they were about to teach the Vorath a lesson that the galaxy would never forget. Part 4. The Vorath ships latched onto neutral station like parasites. Cutting torches began burning through the outer hull. Everyone knew what was coming next. Within minutes, the first breach opened in Docking Bay 7. Vorath warriors poured through the opening. They moved with purpose, their stone-like bodies glowing faintly with internal heat. The bay had been abandoned, or so it seemed. Emergency lights flickered. Cargo containers sat scattered around. There was no resistance. The Vorath moved deeper into the station. A full platoon, 30 warriors strong. They reached the main corridor leading into the residential sections. That's when the first explosion hit. The blast came from above. Danny's soldiers had packed the ceiling panels with improvised explosives made from fuel cells and oxygen tanks. The explosion didn't hurt the Vorath. Their bodies were too tough, but it brought down half the ceiling. Tons of metal and debris crashed down, burying the entire platoon under rubble. The Vorath weren't killed. They were just trapped. And that was the point. Pete Harris watched from the security center as more Vorath breached other sections. Each time, human soldiers led them into traps. Not to kill them because that was nearly impossible, but to slow them down, split them up, and waste their time. In Section 4, Sergeant Katie Sullivan led a team of combat medics. She had watched the footage of Vorath warriors dozens of times. She noticed something others had missed. The Vorath didn't dodge attacks. They walked straight through everything. That meant they weren't just tough. They were confident. Maybe too confident. Katie's team waited in a medical bay. When Vorath warriors entered, the humans ran. They fled down a corridor that led to a dead end. The Vorath followed, certain of an easy victory. When they reached the end of the corridor, Katie triggered the trap. The walls were lined with speakers normally used for announcements. Katie had reprogrammed them. They all activated at once, broadcasting a specific frequency. The sound was painful to humans, but they wore ear protection. To the Vorath, who experienced the world through vibrations in their stone bodies, it was agony. The frequency resonated with their crystalline structure. It didn't crack them or break them. It just made them unable to move without intense pain. The Vorath warriors stood frozen, their bodies vibrating. Katie and her team slipped past them and sealed the section. Throughout the station, similar scenes played out. Humans couldn't win direct fights, so they didn't try. They used the station itself as a weapon. They vented atmosphere from sections not to kill the Vorath who could survive in vacuum, but to send them floating away from their objectives. They locked blast doors and rerouted the Vorath through longer paths. They cut power to areas, forcing the Vorath to navigate in darkness. They flooded corridors with extreme heat and cold, not to harm the Vorath, but to make the metal around them expand and contract, jamming doors and creating obstacles. In the main reactor section, Lieutenant Ben Carver faced a problem. A group of Vorath had reached the power core. If they damaged it, the entire station would explode. Ben only had 5 soldiers with him. Fighting wasn't an option, so he did something crazy. He opened all the emergency vents at once. The reactor room was suddenly exposed to space. Everything not bolted down was sucked out, including the Vorath warriors. They tumbled into the void, their bodies drifting away from the station. Ben quickly sealed the vents again. The Vorath weren't dead. They'd eventually find their way back. But by then, Ben and his team would be somewhere else preparing the next trap. Lisa Grant worked frantically in her lab. She had been studying Vorath biology for weeks now. Their silicon-based structure was unlike anything she'd seen. But she found a weakness. The Vorath bodies generated internal heat to stay active. If they got too cold, they became sluggish. Not frozen, but slower. She contacted Pete with her findings. Within an hour, human soldiers were using fire suppression systems to spray supercooled foam at Vorath warriors. It didn't stop them, but it bought precious seconds. Seconds that humans used to escape, regroup, and set up new traps. The battle raged for hours. More Vorath ships attached to the station. More warriors came through, but they found themselves in a maze designed by humans. Every corridor was a potential trap. Every room could be a dead end. They were stronger, tougher, and more dangerous than any human. But humans were fighting on their terms, not the Vorath's. Ambassador Kravik watched from the command center. He had refused to evacuate, unable to look away from what was happening. He saw 43 human soldiers holding off hundreds of Vorath warriors. It should have been impossible. Vel, the Theron medical officer who had befriended Lisa months ago, stood beside Kravik. She understood now what humans had been trying to explain. This was how they survived. Not through strength, but through stubbornness and creativity. Outside the station, Jake Morrison arrived with the Horizon's Edge. He assessed the situation quickly. The Vorath ships surrounding the station were vulnerable. They were focused on the boarding action. Their shields were down. Their weapons were cold. Jake contacted the few remaining assembly ships in the area. He explained his plan. It was risky and probably stupid. But the other captains had learned to trust human instincts. They agreed. The ships moved in fast, targeting the docking clamps that held the Vorath vessels to the station. Precise weapons fire severed the connections. One by one, Vorath ships were cut loose and sent drifting. Without their ships, the Vorath warriors on the station were stranded. Inside the station, Danny Wright got the message. The Vorath were cut off from reinforcements. Now came the hardest part. The humans had to actually push them off the station. Danny gathered all his soldiers. They were exhausted, running on adrenaline and desperation, but they weren't done. He gave them their orders. Stop running. Start pushing. The humans changed tactics. Instead of avoiding the Vorath, they started hurting them. They sealed sections behind the warriors, forcing them toward the breached docking bays. They used explosives to collapse corridors, creating paths the Vorath had to follow. Katie Sullivan's team used their sonic weapons to drive Vorath warriors toward the breaches. Ben Carver's soldiers used decompression to pull them toward open sections. Every human on the station worked together, coordinating through their communication network. Slowly, section by section, they pushed the Vorath back. It took 6 more hours, 6 hours of constant movement, constant danger, constant fear. But humans were used to fear. They had lived with it their entire existence as a species. Finally, the last Vorath warrior was forced out of the station. Emergency crews sealed the breaches. The battle was over. Danny did a head count. They had lost 12 soldiers, 12 people who gave their lives to save thousands of others. It hurt, but they had held the station. They had done what the entire assembly fleet couldn't do. Jake docked the Horizon's Edge and rushed to find his people. He found Danny first, sitting in a corridor, too tired to move. Then he found Pete in the security center, coordinating damage control. Finally, he found Lisa in her lab, still working, still analyzing, still trying to find better ways to fight the Vorath. They were alive, battered, exhausted, but alive, and the galaxy had just learned something important about humanity. Part 5 news of what happened at Neutral Station spread across the galaxy faster than light. Within days, every species in the assembly knew the story. 43 human soldiers had held off a Vorath invasion force. The species that was supposed to be too fragile to survive had done what entire fleets could not. The Galactic Assembly called an emergency session. This time, the mood was very different. No one was talking about protecting humanity anymore. They were talking about learning from them. Ambassador Kravik stood before the assembly. His voice was strong but humble. He spoke about what he had witnessed. He admitted that the assembly had been wrong about humans. They had measured them by the wrong standards. He explained that the assembly species had evolved in relatively safe environments. They had natural advantages that let them survive. They never had to struggle the way humans did. That made them strong, but it also made them predictable. They fought the way their instincts told them to fight. They used their advantages because they had always worked. Humans were different. They had no advantages. Every day of their evolution had been a fight against extinction. They had to learn to think differently, to fight differently, to survive differently, and that made them dangerous in ways the assembly had never imagined. Kravik proposed something radical. He wanted humans to teach other species their methods, not just military tactics, but the entire human approach to problems, the way they adapted, the way they refused to give up, the way they turned weaknesses into strengths. The proposal passed with overwhelming support. For the first time in assembly history, one species would train all the others. Jake Morrison was given command of the new training program. He didn't want the job at first. He was a ship captain, not a teacher. But Lisa convinced him. She said that this was more important than any battle. This was about changing how the entire galaxy thought. The training facility was built on a moon orbiting a gas giant. It was designed to be harsh, uncomfortable, and challenging. That was the point. Students needed to learn what it felt like to struggle. The first class arrived 3 months later. Officers from 20 different species. Some were soldiers, some were pilots, some were engineers. All of them were the best their species had to offer. All of them thought they knew what to expect. They were wrong. On the first day, Ben Carver stood before the class. He had been promoted to instructor after his actions on Neutral Station. He looked at the assembled aliens and said something that shocked them all. He told them that they were going to fail. Not might fail. Would fail. Every exercise would be designed to be impossible by conventional standards. They would lose fights. They would see their plans collapse. They would face situations where every option looked hopeless. And then they would learn what humans did in those situations. They would learn to cheat. The first exercise was simple. The students were divided into teams and given a combat scenario. They had to defend a position against overwhelming force. The enemy had better weapons, more numbers, and superior positioning. By every tactical measure, the defense was impossible. Most teams tried to fight honorably. They used their training, their natural abilities, and their courage. They lost quickly. One team, led by a Theran officer named Keln, tried something different. He had been paying attention to human stories. Instead of defending the position directly, his team abandoned it. They made it look like they retreated in panic. The enemy forces moved in to claim victory. That's when Keln triggered the explosives his team had hidden in the position. The explosion eliminated most of the enemy force. His team then counterattacked from a different angle and won the scenario. Ben congratulated him. Keln had learned the first lesson. Rules were guidelines, not laws. Survival mattered more than honor. The training continued. Students learned to use terrain in ways they never considered. A Quillith engineer discovered that her natural ability to interface with technology could be used to hack enemy systems, not just friendly ones. A massive Vogarth warrior, used to relying on his strength, learned that running away and fighting later was often smarter than fighting now. Katie Sullivan taught medical students from across the galaxy. She showed them human surgical techniques, how to open bodies, fix problems, and close them back up, how to keep someone alive even when their body was trying to die, how to use technology to replace failed organs. Many students were disturbed at first. The idea of cutting into flesh seemed barbaric, but Katie explained that squeamishness was a luxury. When someone was dying, you did whatever it took to save them. Pride and tradition could wait. Lisa Grant worked with scientists and researchers. She taught them the human approach to problems. When faced with something impossible, humans didn't accept it. They broke it down into smaller problems. They tested solutions. They failed, learned, and tried again. They never stopped asking why. She showed them human history, the diseases humans had cured, the technologies they had invented, the obstacles they had overcome. Every achievement came from refusing to accept limits. One scientist, a being made of crystalline structures who communicated through light pulses, asked Lisa a question. He wanted to know if humans ever felt afraid. If they ever wanted to give up. Lisa was quiet for a moment. Then she told him the truth.
Humans were afraid all the time.
Fear was their constant companion. Every human who had ever lived had felt the urge to quit when things got hard. The difference was that humans had learned not to listen to that urge. They felt the fear, acknowledged it, and then did what needed to be done anyway. That wasn't courage, Lisa explained. It was desperation refined into a survival skill. Months passed. The students struggled, failed, and learned. Slowly, they began to think differently. A Theran pilot learned to fly unpredictably, making herself harder to target. A Zenith commander learned to retreat from battles he couldn't win, saving his forces for better opportunities. A Vogarth warrior learned to use ranged weapons and tactics instead of always charging into combat. They were learning to survive like humans. Not by being stronger, but by being smarter and more adaptable. Near the end of the first training cycle, an incident occurred that tested everything they had learned. A real distress call came in. A civilian transport was under attack by pirates near the training facility. The pirates had superior numbers and firepower. The transport wouldn't survive long. Ben looked at his students. This wasn't a simulation. This was real. People would die if they failed. He asked if anyone wanted to volunteer for the rescue mission. Every single student stood up. They took their training ships and headed for the transport. The pirates saw them coming and laughed. A bunch of trainees against experienced raiders. It should have been easy. But the students didn't fight like their species normally did. They fought like humans. They used the asteroid field for cover. They coordinated their attacks to confuse enemy sensors. They targeted the pirates' engines instead of their weapons, crippling them without destroying them. They rescued the transport and captured the pirates without losing a single ship. When they returned to the training facility, Ben was waiting. He didn't congratulate them or celebrate. He just nodded and said one word: passed. The students had learned the most important lesson. When you're outmatched, you don't fight fair. You fight smart. You use everything you have and everything your enemy doesn't expect, and you never ever give up. The first class graduated. They returned to their species as instructors themselves, spreading what they had learned. More classes followed. The training program expanded. Across the galaxy, the way species thought about combat and survival began to change. It was slow, but it was happening. And it all started because 43 humans refused to abandon a station they had no hope of defending. Part 6. 2 years had passed since the defense of Neutral Station. The Galactic Assembly had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Human influence spread through every level of society. It wasn't through conquest or force. It was through ideas. Jake Morrison now commanded a mixed fleet of human and alien ships. They called themselves the Rapid Response Force. Their job was to handle situations that required creative thinking and unconventional tactics. Basically, problems that couldn't be solved the normal way. The fleet was heading toward a crisis in the Outer Rim. A mining colony had been cut off by a spatial anomaly. Ships couldn't get through without being torn apart. The colonists had food and air for maybe another week. And traditional rescue methods had all failed. Jake studied the problem from every angle. The anomaly was like a storm in space. It twisted reality and shredded anything that entered. No ship could survive passage. No shield could protect against it. Every simulation ended in disaster. His crew included humans and aliens who had been through the training program. They sat in the briefing room staring at the data. The silence stretched on. Finally, a Theran pilot named Keln spoke up. He asked why they were trying to go through the anomaly. Why not go around it? Jake explained that going around would take 3 weeks. The colonists didn't have that long. Keln nodded, then asked another question. If they couldn't take a ship through, could they take something smaller? That sparked an idea. Jake looked at the data again. The anomaly tore apart ships because ships were large, complex objects with lots of parts. But what about something simple? Something small and durable? They designed a probe. Just a metal sphere filled with supplies, medicine, and a communication device. No engines, no complex systems, just a tough shell that could survive impacts. They launched it into the anomaly using a railgun. It worked. The sphere tumbled through the distortion and came out the other side intact. The colonists retrieved it. They had supplies to last another month while the anomaly slowly dissipated naturally. It wasn't a perfect solution. But it was a human solution. When you can't solve a problem one way, you solve it another way. Lisa Grant had taken a different path. She now worked with the Assembly Medical Council. Her job was to share human medical knowledge with other species. But she was learning just as much as she was teaching. Alien medicine was incredible. Some species could regrow limbs naturally. Others could heal from injuries that would kill a human instantly. Still others had immune systems that could adapt to any disease within hours. Lisa realized that humans could learn from this. If they could understand how alien healing worked, maybe they could apply it to humans. Gene therapy, cybernetic implants, and biological engineering all became tools in her research. She worked with Vel, the Theron doctor she had befriended years ago. Together, they started developing hybrid treatments, techniques that combined human innovation with alien biology. They created artificial organs that could adapt like natural ones. They designed medicines that worked across multiple species. They even started work on a universal medical scanner that could diagnose any known life form. Their research saved lives across the galaxy. But more importantly, it proved that cooperation between species could achieve things no single species could do alone. Pete Harris had returned to Earth. He was training the next generation of human soldiers. But he wasn't teaching them to fight. Not primarily. He was teaching them to think. The training program on Earth had become legendary. Students came from all over human space to attend. Pete put them through scenarios that seemed impossible. They learned to use their environment. They learned to adapt to any situation. They learned that victory came from outsmarting opponents, not overpowering them. But Pete also taught them something else. He taught them when not to fight, when to negotiate, when to retreat, when to find solutions that didn't involve violence, because humans had learned that surviving didn't always mean winning. Sometimes it meant finding a way for everyone to survive. One day, a message arrived that changed everything. It came from deep space beyond even the outer rim, a region that no assembly ship had ever explored. The message was in a language no one recognized, but the mathematical patterns were clear. Someone was asking for help. The assembly debated what to do. The unknown region was dangerous. Resources were limited. They had their own problems to deal with. Many species voted to ignore the message. Then Jake stood up in the assembly chamber. He reminded them of something. 2 years ago, the assembly had nearly left humanity to die as wards of other species. They had judged humans as too weak to survive. They were wrong. Now someone else was asking for help. Someone unknown and possibly dangerous. But maybe they deserved a chance too. Maybe the assembly had learned something from humans about not abandoning others, even when it was difficult. The vote passed. An expedition would be sent to find the source of the message. Jake volunteered to lead it. Lisa joined him, curious about what new species they might find. Pete came too, unable to resist one more adventure. Keln and several other graduates of the training program signed up. Even Vel decided to come, bringing her medical expertise. The expedition fleet left assembly space 3 months later. They traveled for weeks through uncharted territory. They saw wonders no one had witnessed before. Stars being born, planets with impossible landscapes, cosmic phenomena that defied explanation. Finally, they found the source of the message. A small planet orbiting a dying star. The inhabitants were like nothing they had ever seen. They were beings made of energy, barely holding themselves together. Their star was fading, and without its light they would cease to exist. Communication was difficult. The energy beings didn't speak or write. They communicated through patterns of light and electromagnetic fields. But slowly, with patience and creativity, the expedition team learned to understand them. The beings told their story. They had evolved in the heart of their star, living in the plasma and radiation. But the star was dying. They had tried to leave to find a new star, but their bodies couldn't survive away from stellar matter. They were trapped, watching their home slowly fade. They had sent the message hoping someone might help, but they expected no one to come. They expected to die alone. Jake looked at Lisa. She looked at Vel. They all knew what they had to do. They couldn't leave these beings to die. But how do you save creatures made of energy? For 3 weeks, the expedition team worked on the problem. They studied the beings. They analyzed the dying star. They ran countless simulations. Nothing worked. Then Katie Sullivan, who had come along as the chief medical officer, had an idea. She pointed out that the beings were like patients with a failing organ. They didn't need a cure. They needed a transplant. But you can't transplant a star, except maybe you could move the patients to a new star. They built containment vessels using magnetic fields and plasma. They designed engines that could transport the beings across space. They plotted a course to the nearest young star, one that would burn for billions of years. It took months of work. The entire expedition crew collaborated. Humans and aliens working together. They made mistakes. They failed repeatedly. But they kept trying. They adapted. They refused to give up. Finally, they succeeded. The energy beings were transferred to the containment vessels. The expedition fleet began the journey to the new star. When they arrived, they released the beings into the stellar atmosphere. The beings danced in the young star's fire. They sent patterns of light that the team translated as pure joy. They had been saved. By strangers. By people who had no reason to help, except that it was the right thing to do. The expedition returned to assembly space as heroes. But more importantly, they returned as proof that the galaxy was changing. Species that had once kept to themselves were now working together. Ideas were being shared. Problems were being solved. And at the center of it all were humans. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest, But because they had taught the galaxy one simple lesson: when faced with the impossible, you don't give up. You find another way. You adapt. You cheat if you have to. You refuse to accept that something can't be done. You keep trying until you succeed or until there are no more options to try. Jake stood on the bridge of the horizon's edge, looking out at the stars. He thought about how far humanity had come. From a single fragile species on a small blue planet to teachers of the entire galaxy. They were still fragile. Their bones still broke. Their bodies still failed. They still lived short lives compared to other species. Nothing about their biology had changed, but they had changed everything else. They had shown the galaxy that strength wasn't about what you were born with. It was about what you refused to die without. Lisa joined him on the bridge. She asked what he was thinking about. Jake smiled and told her he was thinking about home, about Earth, about all the humans who would never leave their planet but who had still contributed to this moment. Every scientist who refused to accept that a disease couldn't be cured. Every engineer who kept trying when a design failed. Every doctor who fought to save one more life. Every person who woke up every day and decided to keep going despite all the reasons not to. That was humanity's real strength. Not genius, not courage, just stubbornness. The absolute refusal to stay down when life knocked them.